family, son.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. It's been far too long since I've made a video. I'm sorry about that. I've been in hypersleep aboard the Cassiopeia, but we've just arrived at Tau Ceti F, so I've got a little bit more spare time, so let's have a little look at Directive 8020. The story begins as the colony ship Cassiopeia approaches the end of her 4-year voyage towards Tau Ceti F. Earth's ecosystems have begun to fail, and this newly found exoplanet may be humanity's only hope. A large tremor rocks the ship and alarms call out to the only 2 crew members not in hypersleep, sleep technicians Thomas Carter and Pari Sims. It seems that a meteorite has struck the hull of the ship, and after consulting with the ship's AI, it becomes clear that the fix must be done manually. So Carter and Sims grab their spacesuits and exit the airlock onto the exterior of the ship. They find the damage and manually activate the breach webbing to seal the hull, blissfully unaware of the organic material deposited by the meteorite. With the hull sealed, the pair make their way back towards the airlock, but as they get close, a panel under Sims's feet explodes, sending her hurtling into space. Luckily, she's able to activate her thrusters and make it back to the relative safety of the hull, where she's caught by Carter. They're both pretty shaken up by this, but understand that they have a job to do. So they climb back through the airlock and go their separate ways to begin fixing the other malfunctions aboard the ship. During their repairs, they stay in contact via the comm system, but all of a sudden Sims cuts out. So Carter leaves his repairs and goes to check on her, finding her in a darkened doorway. She's rambling to herself and clearly in a deep despair. But when he tries to help her, she turns around, igniting the tip of her wedge tool, and rushes towards him. Carter runs for his life and is able to shake his pursuer, but is now left with no option but to stealth his way through the darkened ship. He manages to make it to the safety of his quarters and seals the door behind himself. But as he makes a report on his colleague's behaviour, Sims overrides the door controls and enters the room, and we see the pure terror in Carter's face as the scene fades to black. And that's as far as I'm going to go with the step-by-step for the story. From this point, the remaining crew awaken from hypersleep and must understand what happened here, what this strange organic growth is, and who they can trust when the threat can perfectly mimic anyone. So let's move on to what I actually thought of the story. Overall, I really enjoyed what Supermassive did with this game. I found all of the characters and the way the story was told to be quite compelling. The pacing was good, and outside of a few gameplay issues I'll discuss later, it never really dragged on. But that's not to say that there isn't issues. This game is quite clearly influenced by John Carpenter's The Thing. And unfortunately, Supermassive just weren't able to capture the same sense of nerve-wracking paranoia. It's far from the worst criticism, because I believe if the influence wasn't so obvious, I wouldn't have noticed it was lacking. So overall, I thought it was a good story and it was told well. Now let's move on to the gameplay. Okay, well I'm sure most if not all of you know how these games play, but just in case you've never played a Dark Pictures game, I'll give you a brief rundown of the gameplay loop. The Dark Pictures Anthology are cinematic choice-based narrative experiences. Typically they jump between exploration sections where you find documents and collectibles, cutscenes with quick-time events, and narrative decisions that create branching paths and often have fatal consequences. And all of these core facets of gameplay are present here in Directive 8020, but there are a couple of extra systems that have been added for this game. The first of these new additions is Turning Points. Essentially, it gives you the ability to go back immediately and remake your decisions if you don't like the outcome, which honestly for me is a really nice quality of life addition. Especially if, much like myself, you're strapped for time, you've got kids, you've got a job. It's really nice to not have to play the whole game again if you don't want to. And if you like to keep to the traditional style with the consequences and permadeath, all you have to do is not use the system. It's the best of both worlds. And the other new addition is the stealth sections, which is where I think Supermassive unfortunately missed the mark in my opinion. Though these sections can sometimes be intense and anxiety inducing, they are just used far too often and become very generic with little to distinguish the encounters from one another except your surroundings. Which on a personal level is a real shame, because this game leaning more into a traditional third-person gameplay was one of the things that I was really interested in. It just wasn't implemented as well as it could have been. That being said, as a whole, the gameplay is still good, and if you've played the previous titles, it will definitely feel familiar, even with these changes. You've still got all the decision making and quick time events, but maybe some of those stealth sections should have been handled in a more cinematic way, which leads me on to this game's presentation. And it may come as no surprise to you that this game looks great. Supermassive have always provided excellent visuals, and their performance capture in this game is really putting in some work. It's about as close to photorealistic as I've seen so far, and a lot of the uncanny valley vibes from previous titles just aren't here. Well, for the most part. And as always, it leans heavily into cinematic framing and shot composition, which really helps drive the drama in a familiar and believable manner. But unfortunately, with this game aiming to deliver more traditional gameplay, the camera is largely stuck in an over-the-shoulder third-person position, which removes some of this filmic quality from the game. And I will say that they've done a good job of transitioning between the two perspectives, which at least does make it less jarring. Unlike the game's optimization. Now don't get me wrong, I didn't really suffer from performance issues, but I did have to spend quite a bit of time to get it to run at 4K with a stable 60 frames a second, ultimately having to rely on DLSS, which of course brought its own problems such as particles smearing and leaving trails, and a blurry edge around some characters. And obviously there'll be patches to improve the performance, but I do feel like if I'm running it on a 4090, I shouldn't really have to sacrifice image quality for performance. Okay, I've had my little rant now, so let's move over to the audio. And there's not an awful lot to say about it. Largely the game relies on diegetic audio, such as footsteps, electrical shorts and noises in the distance, using these to create the tension rather than relying on a backing track, and it's actually very effective in this game. But that's not to say there isn't music. When you reach the end of a chapter, you're treated to some licensed music, and they picked some great tunes here, with a personal favourite being their use of Roads by Portishead, instantly taking me back to the mid-90s, sitting around with my friends watching Tank Girl. It genuinely was quite nostalgic. But time marches on and we can't live in the past, so I'll just push forward with my final thoughts. Before I give my final thoughts, I just wanted to say thank you if you've made it this far into the video. Like and subscribe, and please leave me a comment, I love reading them. Okay, so I'm going to keep my final thoughts brief, as I think I've made it quite obvious that I did really like the game. It's not without its flaws, and it's certainly not the best in the Dark Pictures Anthology. But it has genuinely compelling and human-feeling characters, an interesting story, and great atmosphere, with a fantastic twist that I never saw coming. There's a lot to like here, and it by far outweighs the negatives. I would have preferred if they used the curator more like they did in the previous entries, and that's certainly not something that's going to take away from the overall experience for anyone. So overall, I'll say it's absolutely worth playing if you like this type of game. It may not be worth full price if you're a bit strapped for cash, but I managed to get a CD key and pick it up for about 25 quid, and at that price it's definitely worth it. And with that said, we've come to the end of the video. Like and subscribe, leave me a comment, I love you all, and I'll see you on the next video.